I'm a medical patient, and I found that this whole legalization has totally disrupted the supply chain that has been in existence. People are unable to get their arthritis cream, unable to get their cannabis medication, and the CMA's official position is that there should not be two separate streams. I disagree with that vehemently. I think that right now, medical patients, I mean, we are the ones that basically were on the front lines fighting for this. The reason that legalization is here is because we were fighting for it. And now it seems that access is being denied. It's a great big conundrum for most of us. We cannot get access to our medications, and there seems to be no plan to do so. The stores right now only offer dry bud and oil of less than 3%, which is not medicinal. Okay? So what are the actual plans right now to develop a system that addresses the medical cannabis need that has existed and will continue to exist in spite of the plans of the government that I hear to do away with the separate stream? Within 5 years, there will be no consideration for medical cannabis. What's the story with that?
Thank you very much. That's a great question and really a fundamental policy issue that we're discussing. So I would say there's no plan to dismantle the medical system. I think what was publicly committed to was a review of the medical system. So when we were forging ahead towards legalization of non-medical cannabis, I think the decision was, well, we have a medical system in place that is working. Let's keep it, and we will review it over time to see the impacts of how non-medical legalization is impacting the medical regime. Is it still serving the need? Do adjustments need to be made? And
you can't buy the product.
Oh, sorry. I'm just going to ask that you.
So the products. I mean, so the medical system remains where if you have a doctor's documentation, you can register with a federal licensee to order directly. And one new provision we put in the regulations is previously you were sort of committed to that one licensed producers until you get a new medical document. So you were kind of bound to that licensed producer. You now can request that document be transferred to another producer. If your product that you want is not available, you can ask to be transferred to another producer to access it in that manner. We also have a new provision where if you have a medical documentation and you want to purchase from a non-medical retail store, you can have authorization, sort of possession authorization, to possess more than the 30-gram limit if your medical needs require that. So if you want to walk around with 60 grams because you're traveling somewhere, you need a month's supply or whatever, you can have that documentation from Health Canada that will authorize you for possession limits.
The problem is access.
Sorry, I'm going to let all of the panelists answer the question, and I am going to ask that participants ask a question, and then if you feel like you'd like more detail, I think all of the panelists have indicated they will be here during the breaks.
Thank you for coming out and engaging with us all today, and thank you, Brenda, for acknowledging the work of activists for decades before I even showed up on the scene. I think I need to elaborate on the question about medical access. While it is true there is a system, I am part of that system, I'm a registered medical patient. I have a credit card, so I can go online and spend $400 to get my medicine delivered to me, and when it arrives, I have to take whatever I get. I believe the concern for patients and the issue of access is that dispensaries have already existed and demonstrated an ability to provide the access, particularly to patients who are of low income, who do not have a credit card, who cannot afford $400, or the minimum of a 5-gram order, which equals $50 at least. For many medical patients, they walk down the street to a dispensary with $5 cash in their pocket, and they can get a joint, and they can look at it and decide which one they want by the smell and know if it'll work, and then they can go home and smoke half that joint that night and half the next day. They don't have to wait 3 days for the post office to deliver mail from a larger producer. So the issue of access, I think, is that for most medical consumers, they've already seen a working model, And right now, as the newspapers are proving, a lot of the medical cannabis access is being lost to the recreational market because the licensed producers are so limited that their supply is going to the recreational market to meet the demands of the government contracts they signed on to across the country. So why would the government not allow the legalization and licensing of the existing industry and providers, similar to how in other provinces Uber and Airbnb were illegal but got regulated into existence? They weren't replaced. And the vast majority of the existing cannabis industry and the dispensaries that are in the court case right now with the City of Vancouver, which we hope to make peace. We want to exist peacefully and be included. But I think the major concern for access for patients is that the dispensary model of medical dispensaries worked, and now the provincial rules prohibit the mention of medical or dispensaries in the name of the business, is my understanding. So it removes the medical angle, because if cannabis is medicine, how can you arrest people for it? So my question is, will the City of Vancouver and the province of British Columbia and the federal government acknowledge that there is a model in place that already works, and the people in that model are begging to be included and begging to be able to transition instead of excluded and demonized as illegal cannabis providers, when legalization should mean there isn't any illegal cannabis? So will you accommodate storefront medical dispensaries providing the access to the enormous supply that already exists? Because there is no shortage of cannabis in British Columbia or Canada. There's a shortage of the legal cannabis, but there's illicit cannabis begging to be licit, wanting to be legal. Will there be a quick effort to transition the existing industry into legalization through the retail, wholesale, growing, and all those fronts, instead of trying to eliminate it? That's my question.
Thank you, Joy.
I think those arguments are not new. We've heard them before, for sure. I guess on the first part of your point and your question about transitioning, allowing, giving a pathway for those facilities to come within the legal system. I think that's largely decisions at the provincial and municipal level, creating a pathway for that to happen. In Ontario, the government said if you were to close by October 17th, you can reapply for Ontario's retail market in the spring. But to the other points about positioning yourself as a medical retail outlet, I think from a federal perspective, the position is that, again, we don't have the evidence base to make health claims. So I think the position, the policy from the government is that precautionary principle. We don't want storefronts or whatever giving medical advice from cannabis until there's definitive research. So that was part of the conversation this morning in my talk about the need for research. So we're trying to create that evidence base in the research so that if we can make those claims, we can be in a position to provide, doctors and others can be in a position to provide that type of advice. So I think there's still ways to go on that medical regime and building up that evidence base in the research bit.
And then on the provincial side, the province is regulating non-medical sales, and it is open to individuals who have operated illegal dispensaries to make an application to be licensed under that provincial retail regime. But it is correct that it's a non-medical regime, and that those who are licensed will need to buy only from federally licensed producers the product that is regulated and tested.
Kathy, any comment?
Really nothing further. I mean, we're a bit down the chain, right? In that we're really bound by what legal product is actually available to be sold. And I think that's what I'm hearing as the concern is the product itself isn't quite what the consumers are looking for. And that's really, again, municipal role is beyond that, is really just around where and how it's operating in community. But what's on the shelves, we really look to our provincial and federal colleagues to really set what those products can be.
And I think one of the things that's really important for somebody like me who's new, to the cannabis community and new to cannabis consumption is that I do agree that providing medical advice, if you are not somebody, for example, who was one of the original compassion clubs, or somebody who has a real in-depth knowledge of cannabis, a first-time bad experience can turn somebody off, whether they're a medicinal or recreational user. And I do believe that the research is out there. I don't believe that the research has become mainstream enough or peer-reviewed enough or legitimized by existing health organizations, whereas I do understand government, who does have a bigger burden than a lot of us in dealing with this file, that we do have to do a better job. But as we've talked about, this is a transition and it's a beginning, and it's a bumpy one, but I think we will get there. But I would be equally as concerned if I were walking into a retail store or referring a friend, as I refer many now, to one of the dispensaries that I believe the person behind the counter has the type of knowledge to be giving them some advice. But if it was a new, fresh person being hired and having somebody not consume the product properly the first time and have them had a bad experience, they are going to remove themselves from having cannabis be an option, whether it's for medicinal or recreational use. So I think we do have a responsibility around the issue of claims. And I do believe now, and I'm very, very hopeful, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, that a lot of the research dollars that have been allocated in the budget do go out to those people who can bring that information forward for patients and for consumers, but also do it in a way that's easy to digest. Government speak is sometimes very complicated, and don't know a lot of people who will have time to read a 300-page report, but I think that making sure that it's communicated in a way that people can easily access and understand will be very, very important.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, that I think the dialogue and the evidence base needs to be in the public domain, ideally in the public domain and in the academic domain, and not in the court system, which has unfortunately sort of been the case to this point, where evidence has been sort of through courts and decisions have been made, and where we are in the medical regime has been driven largely by the court system. So hopefully going forward, we don't need to rely on the courts to make decisions for us, that we can collectively sort of have an evidence base to make logical policy going forward.
I really appreciate you guys coming here. I've been a marijuana activist for a long time, and I'm looking forward to this country moving in the right direction on these things. But just before my question quickly, I think that the idea that there's not enough evidence to move forward and protect the patients that are using cannabis now is, quite frankly, in my opinion, preposterous. Yeah. I know that there is maybe a lack in some cases of peer-reviewed studies and stuff, but anecdotal evidence is a form of evidence. And actually right now there's lots of peer-reviewed studies on cannabis being done around the world, thousands of them, that show the medical benefits. So to have a government official saying there's not enough evidence is not, I think that's inaccurate. And also the idea that, well, it's been in the courts and we need to, the politicians need to look at that. The reason that it's been in the courts is because the politicians have refused to look at the evidence that's there. And they've refused to make moves for a long time in this country to move on these things. We're finally catching up. But this idea that you have to have new research, cannabis has been researched for a long time and it's been proven in the courts. And that's why we've had to go to the courts, and judges have said that this is absolutely something that helps people. So in my opinion, I don't think that's a good enough answer. But my question is something that was raised a couple times here, is the idea of consumption spaces. So in Vancouver, I'm the CEO of Cannabis Culture. We've had consumption spaces in Vancouver for over a dozen years. And there's hundreds, thousands of people that come to use cannabis. They bring their own cannabis to consume in our consumption spaces. We're providing a safe place for these people to use, because as you guys have mentioned, with the new rules going forward, there's a lot of issues on where people can consume, and that's for medical patients as well. The apartment that I live in, I will not be able to consume in, and most of the apartments in Vancouver are going to be like that. You can't consume in parks, you can't consume in your car. As you said, you can't consume close to buildings, so you kind of have to walk down the middle of the street to smoke your pot, pretty much. So again, I didn't hear you guys give any response to consumption. consumption spaces. In Vancouver, liquor is consumed everywhere. We have 77 liquor stores open, but we also have thousands of places where you can go and consume liquor on every street corner. In fact, they're talking about allowing it in parks. I can go to the barber shop and get my hair cut and get a beer. So are you guys working on consumption spaces? It's a dire need. Our community has said that we need these things. The medical community needs them. We need a safe consumption space, just like all the other substances will have. Are you guys working on that, and what are you going to do to provide those for Canadians who drastically need that?
I think that's up to the province and the municipality. I don't think Health Canada has taken a position, and it's not within your jurisdiction, right? So Mary, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure, happy to speak to that one. So I guess the place to start on that is that I think we've recognized at the province all along that the legalization date was just the start, and that licensed consumption spaces are something that we can consider in future. I guess I will say that part of the decisions that we took with respect to public use were informed precisely by the fact that we don't have licensed consumption spaces now like we do for alcohol. And so I get lots of cards and letters equally from people who are concerned about the fact that we're letting people use cannabis in public. And they say, not allowed to use alcohol in public, why are people allowed to do this? And I say precisely because they are different, right? You can use alcohol in your home. Some people will not be able to smoke in their homes. And you can find licensed alcohol consumption places all over the place. So yeah, it's definitely something that can be looked at in future. But like I say, we generally have not restricted the consumption of non-inhaled forms of cannabis. And there are public spaces where people will be able to smoke and vape it.
So I'd like to start off with this picture of Red Rocks Amphitheatre, which if any of you ever have the opportunity to visit Denver, this is a must-see for any kind of music or movie. It's a world-renowned venue, it's a park, it's a point of pride for our city, and it's actually owned and operated by the city government as well. And so people have ownership of it and feel very much that Red Rocks is a part of the city's identity. The other thing, of course, about Red Rocks is that people have been smoking grass at Red Rocks since we still called it smoking grass, right? Like, this has been happening for a long time. And it never really seemed to be much of a public concern. After legalization, after we implemented this, the complaints started going through the roof. Every night there was a concert there, the city would get flooded with talk of, why is cannabis smoking allowed in the amphitheater? I got my kids there, the smoke is annoying to me. Basically every kind of complaint you could expect. And it was interesting to me that that happened post-legalization. And what it did was sort of illustrated to me that because it's legal now, because people are taking an interest in this subject, and because people actually are trying to figure out what is legal and what isn't, the city needs to do a better job of delineating for folks where this can be consumed and how. During the summer and fall months, our cannabis team on the Denver Police Department does nothing but enforce against illegal home grows. That's a different kind of black market that I was mentioning earlier. You know, again, our local trade, that's mostly been absorbed by the regulated market. Our police department has a data analyst that goes through every single crime in the city of Denver and flags the one that have a direct correlation to cannabis. That's less than 0.5% of overall crime in Denver. So it's an issue, it's absolutely a problem, but to put it into some perspective, you know, a city of Denver size, 700,000 people, has a lot of other issues that are happening that have nothing to do with cannabis. As it was mentioned earlier today, where do you let this happen? And once you decide on a direction and you start to unpack the issues, you realize very quickly how difficult this is, because no one wants it in their backyard, but everyone wants a place to do this, right? It's a legal product, it can be purchased legally, it can be grown legally, it can be consumed and carried legally, but where are you supposed to enjoy it? And we have a particular issue in our state constitution that public consumption of cannabis is illegal. And we have not had the legislative action in Colorado to further define that and create some carve-outs that would necessitate the ability for local jurisdictions to put in place something that actually works. Denver voters pushed a social use initiative that passed, but unfortunately, in order to comport with all of the state laws, including our ban on public consumption, it doesn't create a successful business model. So you've got a situation where you can't do it in a cannabis store, you can't do it anywhere that alcohol is served, you can't do it in public, and there are the same sort of distance restrictions on these places that we have for other types of cannabis businesses. So it's hard to create a business model that will work for social use, and until we have something that retailers can actually carve out a space of their facility, or a tasting room type of model, or something like that for cultivators to have samples and things like that, we're still going to run into this issue. And what that does is creates a headache for local law enforcement, and it, in my opinion, makes cities look bad when you've got a place like Red Rocks, where of course you're not going to be able to enforce those types of laws when you've got 10,000 people at a concert enjoying a show. So what we've done is created a system of rules that we can't enforce, and that's problematic. So this is always something that I sort of flag to other cities and certainly provincial governments that are dealing with this to try to figure out where and how and when we can do these things.
I work in cumulative effects analysis and land use planning. I got invited to go down to UC Davis and make a presentation relating to salmon. And when I got down there, I spent a week with a bunch of biologists working on salmon, and found out that one of the big problems for them in the Sacramento River was the illegal cannabis grow in Northern California that in the middle of the night was drawing down river levels, and there was no water left for the fish. And so I started to realize the potential significance of this industry. And then got introduced to Scott later on, and I started to learn more about the King City experience, and I just want to share some of, I guess, what I've learned from them, and maybe bring it back home to Canada and British Columbia and show you some examples. I have this, first of all, do you guys know what this is? It's a newspaper, yeah. Who reads a newspaper? All right, that's pretty good. I read this one, it's free to my house. I also have a bunch of subscriptions on my phone, but it is still nice to actually have it. So I've got this up on the screen, and I took out some of the text to protect the innocent. There's a corporation there that's in this article. But this arrived on my doorstep just a few days ago, up in the Shuswap. Cannabis facility gets mixed response. And so when I look through here, I see that this company is building one of the largest medical cannabis operations in Western Canada. And I didn't even know about it. I'm in land use planning, didn't even know about it. And apparently, as you read through the article, they've really done a lot of good homework. They're building it. It's a totally organic operation. It's well financed. They purchased good land for it. They've even gone to NASA for technology to contain the smell, so it's supposed to be completely contained. They're going to recycle 85% of their water. Sounds like a great operation. But as you can see, the public's wondering about it, and so is the Agricultural Land Reserve. And it occurred to me that this is often how, I hope that they're really successful, but this is often how we end up with business as usual in British Columbia, but also in Canada in terms of land use. And what it can do is it can put a really good business opportunity at risk. So just relate back to another project. I don't know if any of you have gone through Salmon Arm, but we now have a Smart Centers shopping development there. But in 2012, Smart Centers moved in, with Walmart and all of that, and they actually, behind the scenes, purchased land, made a deal with the city, didn't tell anybody, approvals were put in place, they got permits, and they started building, and then people went, hey, what's going on? The land you're building in is the delta of the Salmon River, and it's surrounded by a bunch of indigenous land. It's navigable waters under federal administration, and things started to slow down. So they started to go ahead, but then as you can see in the paper, Smart Centers construction in limbo. They didn't have the public buy-in. starting to manage the PR, trying to win over the public after the fact. Wasn't working out. Then they got sued. And lo and behold, like we were talking about 2 years of planning, Rob mentioned 2 years of work. That's a small little amount of time. This thing was hung up for about 4 or 5 years and cost millions and millions of dollars in litigation just because at the beginning, all of the neighbors around this potential operation weren't brought into the process to develop it and become, you know, essentially owners in the development and benefactors. And that's what I want to talk about, is that if you're thinking about developing a facility or an operation, you got to think holistically, you got to think about the watershed, you got to think about all of your neighbors and how you're impacting them, or else this can happen. And eventually, they got the permit, they got everything through, but they had to make concessions. They suffered major costs, and now have spent the last 5 or 6 years trying to repair relationships. So the facility is way smaller than it should have been. That takes down the economics. And it just reminded me when I opened up my newspaper, and these guys have a great plan. They've built 2 buildings. Now the Agricultural Land Reserve has changed the rules. They thought they would just build covered facilities. It'd be like a barn full of cows making milk. But if you're going to do this on Agricultural Land Reserve, you have to keep dirt on the floor. You can't put concrete in. And so their next 8 buildings are in limbo. So what's that cost? What's that hidden cost to the developer, to the shareholders, to the potential workers, to who will benefit from the product?
First off, it's really important to understand that the prohibition against promotion of cannabis is extremely broad. What the Act does is it basically creates a blanket prohibition on promotion of cannabis, and it defines promotion extremely broadly. At the second bullet there, promotion means a representation about the thing or service by any means, whether directly or indirectly, that is likely to influence and shape attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors about the thing or service. You know, you cannot associate cannabis with a way of life. You cannot promote cannabis in a way that there are reasonable grounds to believe is attractive to youth. Not sure how that's going to be interpreted, but the BC Act is also extremely problematic from my perspective, or at least it's very broad. So a person, again, it's a broad prohibition on people, must not promote cannabis for the purpose of, sorry, that's a spelling mistake, purposes of selling it, and must not solicit, receive, or take orders for the sale or purchase of cannabis. Promote is not defined, solicit is not defined in the statute. So, there are exceptions for the government. They can do all these things. The government's employees can do these things. Federal producers can promote only in relation to the sale to government. So governments talking to LPs are sort of exempted from this general prohibition. They can say whatever they want to each other, basically. And BC doesn't have jurisdiction outside of the province, and so that's why, you know, they can't regulate the speech of an LP in BC in relation to outside of the province, so some other business outside of the province. They're not regulating that. That will be the federal statute and the other province's statute if the speech is in the other province. And then there's the licensees and employees of licensees. So the licensee question is again problematic. I think everyone has the impression that if you get a retail license, you can engage in promotion. I don't think that that's particularly clear in the statute, because there are 2 types of licenses. There's a retail license, and then there's what's called a marketing license. It is prohibited in provincial law to advertise or promote any place in the province as a place to consume cannabis, or, and I find this unusual, to spend time after consuming cannabis. So you can't talk about that. No one can talk about that. That's very broad and highly restrictive of the speech. There's also prohibitions on entertainments and games in retail store, which is drawn from the liquor space, but is not clearly defined and potentially overbroad. So that's the general summary of advertising law. Then there's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So many people know about free speech, but most
who aren't lawyers are not as familiar about the protections under our charter for commercial speech. Commercial speech is a protected type of speech. So the section is 2B, right? Everyone has the fundamental freedom to of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. So the Supreme Court of Canada has in several cases decided that commercial speech, i.e. speech about commercial activities, is more than just about economics, and it is protected under Section 2B of the Charter because it deals, and this is really important for cannabis, because cannabis is really different here than all of the precedent cases that we've dealt with. Because look at what the court has said a couple decades ago. Informed choice by individuals, self-fulfillment, personal autonomy. These are three of the fundamental pillars of the legalization of cannabis. And yet, as I will get into, the federal government has modeled its cannabis advertising laws off of the jurisprudence under this charter section dealing with tobacco advertising, which is a very different history. So first off is the right. And just for you non-lawyers out there, in Canada, even if a right is infringed, the government is permitted to justify that right under Section 1 of the Charter, right? So the section there says a government can basically impose a reasonable limit on that right that is prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And the courts have set out tests for those things. Basically, the tests look at whether the government has a pressing and substantial purpose for restricting the right. So if speech is restricted, you're basically infringing Section 2B. If the speech is protected and it's restricted, then usually Section 2B is infringed. It's actually fairly easy to pass that part of the legal test. Then we get to the real battleground for free speech cases, and the first ground is, okay, if your government's going to restrict speech, what's their purpose? Is it pressing and substantial? Then that's not enough. Is the law rationally connected to that purpose? So, in the Cannabis Act situation, the evidence of harm of cannabis is underdeveloped, as we know. It's far less convincing. We know that cannabis has medical benefits for some individuals, and we have a court decision that has protected the access to cannabis for medical users. There's nothing like that in tobacco context, absolutely nothing. So that already changes the context for the Cannabis Act restrictions, speech restrictions, I would say in an order of magnitude. Eliminating the black market. What does that mean exactly? And how is that going to be effectively achieved in a way that is fair and reasonable for because not everyone in the black market is the same, for example. On the other hand, another part of my brain, the lawyer enforcement part, goes, well, if there's leniency forever, then you're actually giving the legal producers who have spent all this money on developing, complying with the licenses, developing their brands, you're just screwing them, basically, if you don't start enforcing these things. But where is that line? And how do you actually effectively roll in legalization and take out black market while giving this fair process to those who may transition? Because I don't think that's clear. And I don't think that alcohol prohibition is a good example anymore because it's almost 100 years ago. So maybe we'll jump to Bert and then just open it to whoever wants to say anything.
British Columbia came out of prohibition in 1921. And the government official that was in charge of prohibition, ensuring the prohibition was enforced, was a gentleman by the name of Walter Finley. And he was arrested and charged, convicted a little bit around 1920. Because he too was guilty of bootlegging. And it's an interesting story that they came out of prohibition because the prohibition wasn't working. People wanted access to that product, alcohol. There's an old saying, there go the people, and I must get behind them and follow them, for I am their leader. And that's basically what happened out of prohibition. And coming forward now to cannabis, I'm a firm believer that people who've been in the cannabis business, who've been operating cannabis stores, should be allowed to get licensed. No question about it. How you get rid of the black market, you have to do it through careful screening of people, but I think the government's gone over. We've got the black market, if you will, for gang members and involved in liquor still today. And when I go down through Vancouver, I can point out a bunch of bars that I know that they're involved in one way or the other. They're either the landlord, they're a shareholder, there's a profit sharing agreement, the liquor branch never sees, whatever, but they're there, they're involved. And you'll never get rid of it totally in cannabis, I don't believe, but I don't think it's fair to hold back people who are legitimate people who pay taxes, employing people who have been in the business. You guys are to Nassau, what are to cannabis, what NASA is to space. And you understand it. And the government hasn't been talking to you because they look upon you folks as living off the proceeds of crime.
And to keep the big picture in focus and decide that they wanted to have a sustainable community. And by that, they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose sight of the long-term viability of the city.